Okay, so welcome to what I believe is now the second lecture on humanitarian intervention. This lecture is going to discuss the arguments for and against intervention. And to begin with, just a bit of a discussion about the term humanitarian intervention. It's a very contested term. So some definitions, for example, would be very broad definitions, including any involvement in another country by one country in another for the purposes of humanitarianism. So that might even include aid deliveries to a war zone, for example, might be considered in a very broad definition of humanitarian intervention as such an intervention. Another much more narrow definition would suggest that humanitarian intervention refers solely to the use of military force for humanitarian reasons carried out against the will of the state in which it's carried out. This definition would, for example, rule out the British intervention in Sierra Leone in 2000 under that definition, because Britain was at that point invited in by the Sierra Leonean government to help crush a rebellion in the state. Others have contested and rejected the very term humanitarian intervention, including, for example, Kofi Annan, the former Secretary General of the United Nations, who argued the term is so politically loaded that it should be dropped altogether. He argued that military intervention should never be confused with humanitarian action such as aid delivery and so on. And it can be very detrimental to the work of humanitarian agencies who are delivering aid if they become associated and perhaps tainted with military intervention. So that's just by means of introducing the idea that the very term itself is contested and controversial. This lecture, for the purposes of this lecture, will define humanitarian intervention as the use of military force for humanitarian rather than, for example, strategic or economic objectives. So any use of military force that is supposedly for humanitarian objectives, and whether or not it has the support of the state in which it's involved. So to begin with, let's look at some of the arguments in favor of humanitarian intervention. Basically, there's one basic argument, right, which is that humanitarian intervention is good because it saves lives. It's supposed to save lives, usually to stop people being massacred, for example. And so let's break this down though a little bit. Of course, there's an idea that we have it's a basic moral principle, isn't it? That if we're in a position to do something for someone else, and saving their life is about the most useful thing you could do for someone else, you have a moral obligation to do so. So this is the basic argument number one. We have a moral obligation to save people's lives if we are able to do so. And the argument is that humanitarian intervention does indeed save lives. So the argument would be, if you look at cases like in 1991, following the US-UK bombing of Iraq, after that, there was then a UN resolution to impose a no-fly zone in northern Iraq and the Kurdish areas of Iraq, which would prevent Saddam Hussein's air force from flying over Kurdistan and therefore being able to bomb rebel Kurd positions and so on. And the argument is that establishing this no-fly zone, this was a form of military intervention by the West, sanctioned by the UN, and it prevented Iraqi government attacks on Kurdish areas, and therefore it saved lives, and therefore that was morally good. Other examples would be in 1999, when it was argued that an intervention by NATO, this time not with the authority of the UN, actually saved the lives of many, many ethnic Albanians by preventing and ending the Yugoslav army's involvement in Kosovo, forcing the Yugoslav army out of Kosovo. The argument was the Yugoslav army was committing massacres, and some said even genocide against ethnic Albanians in Kosovo, and therefore this intervention by NATO saved their lives by putting a stop to those incursions. A year after that, British intervention in Sierra Leone, it's argued, ended the 10-year civil war there by helping to bring about a decisive victory on the government side. And so that brought about peace, and that ended the lives that would have been lost if the war had continued. Put an end to the brutal massacres being committed by the Revolutionary United Front, the RUF. And then in 2011, you could look at Libya. The argument, of course, the Libyan intervention. Well, there's two aspects of the argument that the Libyan intervention saved lives, really. One is that it prevented a massacre of citizens of Benghazi. Remember, there had been threats made by Gaddafi to go house to house and have no mercy for the rebels and so on. The rebel groups themselves argued, and the NATO countries picked up this claim, that the Libyan army was going to massacre all the civilians of Benghazi in punishment for the town's takeover by rebel forces. Figures were quoted in The Guardian of 500,000 civilians being on the verge of being massacred and so on. So the argument that the NATO intervention there, by blocking the Libyan army's takeover, reconquest of Benghazi, saved the lives of thousands, maybe hundreds of thousands of people. The second aspect to the argument about Libya is that eventually the intervention there put a stop to, well, I mean, this is very controversial to say it put a stop to the civil war there, because there's still civil war today, but it's a different civil war, you could argue. And supporters of that intervention argue that what NATO intervention did is ended the civil war between the government and the rebels, with a decisive victory this time for the rebels, and thereby ended that civil war. And if the intervention hadn't happened, the civil war would have dragged on, and you might have got Libya more in a case of what we see in Syria. Now, in Libya, the civil war of 2011 cost probably an estimated around 30 or 40,000 lives. The civil war that's been going on now 7 years in Syria cost around 400,000 lives. So there's an argument that humanitarian intervention, if it can end civil war, then that saves lives as well. Then, of course, linked to that, other examples would be, we'll look at the cost of non-intervention. So in 1994, in Rwanda, there wasn't an intervention to prevent the massacres taking place, and an estimated 800,000, mostly Tutsi civilians, were massacred as a result. Similar arguments are made with Srebrenica in the former Yugoslavia 2 years later in 1996, when an estimated 8,000 Muslim men and boys were said to have been massacred by Bosnian Serb forces. And again, the argument is that intervention could have saved those lives. So that's the basic argument. Humanitarian intervention is designed to save lives. It works. And if we can save lives, then we should. Building on from this argument, the second aspect would be this, or second kind of justification for why we have this obligation to save lives, would be this idea of common humanity, or what's called indivisible humanity. Humanity is indivisible. Human rights, therefore, are universal. And our moral responsibilities extend not just to others within our own state or others of our own ethnicity or nation, but our moral responsibilities extend to all of humanity. This can be linked as well to Peter Singer, the moral philosopher, his concept of general benevolence, which is, if we can do something to alleviate suffering, without causing kind of similar level of suffering, then again, we're morally obliged to do that. And this argument especially would apply in cases where large-scale atrocities are being carried out. And there's actually, since the year 2000, a commission was established in the year 2000 by the Canadian government, the International Commission on Intervention and State Sovereignty. And this commission looked into these kind of issues of when is it permissible to intervene in another state for humanitarian reasons, when is it necessary to do so, looked at these arguments and came out with the doctrine of responsibility to protect, R2P, which has been accepted by the UN General Assembly since 2005. And this argues that it's permissible and indeed necessary for other countries, for the international community, to intervene in a state if there is, in order to prevent or stop large-scale loss of life or large-scale ethnic cleansing. Those are the only two criteria, it argues, when such intervention is legitimate. A third argument would be this idea of global interdependence linked to the idea of enlightened self-interest. This was the argument put forward by Tony Blair during the bombing of Yugoslavia over the Kosovo crisis in 1999. He made a speech in which he created this idea of the doctrine of the international community. And part of his argument was that what happens in one part of the world, in today's globally interlinked and interdependent world, what happens in one part of the world affects all the other parts of the world. So therefore, it's in our own enlightened self-interest to alleviate others' suffering. For example, he argued if massacres are allowed to take place, if civil wars are allowed to drag on without other countries intervening to put a stop to them, then this can create regional instability. This can create huge refugee flows. This can create situation in which conflict festers, resentment festers, that spills over borders. This is the key point, is that conflicts in the modern world cannot be contained, and their effects spill over borders. They have transnational effects. And therefore, if we don't want to be affected by crises, even if they're in other parts of the world, then we need to intervene to put a stop to suffering and crises and civil war and so on. So this was the argument that Cameron then used in 2011 to justify the intervention in Libya. This is one of the arguments he used, which is that if Britain and its allies didn't intervene in Libya to put a stop to the civil war there, or to prevent the massacres he argued were going on, then the conflict would fester, it would spill over its borders, it would create floods of refugees into Europe, and so on and so forth. So it was in the enlightened self-interest of Britain and other European states and other states around the world to put a stop to that conflict before it caused other problems. Terrorism, of course, another problem you could see. If massacres continue on, then that can be a breeding ground for the kind of resentment and violence that fosters terrorism, which then has, global reach potentially. So I would say those are kind of three of the main basic arguments. All of them really are just developments of the basic argument that we have this moral obligation to save lives if we're in a position to do so. But there are other ways we can develop these arguments as well. Other supporters of humanitarian intervention have, especially liberals here, have argued that the promotion of democracy is something that should always be supported. I'm going to pause the video for a second.